and gentlemen, I'm very happy that you come here. In these 2 days, we have the first assembly of our executive committee. When I'm speaking about us, this is what we call us HMS. It's a Haifa Center for Research of Maritime Policy and Strategy. This is the first assembly, and we tried that the chair of the committee is Admiral alone, but we tried also to bring in people that will give us some benchmark, since we are only in the first year of our operation. And we mentioned yesterday that we might have a conflict between an academic research and public-oriented research, and we try to solve it. And there is the third issue, and I think that Admiral Raphad mentioned it also, to speak about what does it mean maritime awareness in Israel. Awareness in Israel, because I think that there is not maritime awareness in Israel, and the question is how you bring it into the public. So we have decided to ask the various people from the executive committee, and beside Admiral Raphad, that in a minute I will introduce him, to have Professor John Hattendorf from the Naval War College, emeritus professor, 30 years ex-naval officer, but 30 years of background in this aspect. When I'm teaching, I told it yesterday to Professor Hattendorf, when I teach the student from the Naval Academy about naval strategy, and as he mentioned, naval strategy or maritime strategy is very young, not more than 130 years or something like this. And they are very lazy, and you know that they have to read, and they have to read in English because there is some kind of translation to Hebrew about Mahan. I used his article, What is Maritime Strategy? And I asked the student to read it. I hope that they read it because he summarized what is maritime strategy, and especially what is the difference between maritime strategy and naval strategy, which we are trying to also to mention, because I think that the Navy is the Israeli Navy, doing a very good job, but it's only part of the broad aspect of maritime strategy. So we have Professor Hattendorf with us. Another guy that we have is David Obarski. David, from the executive committee, a big supporter also, and I think that after the hearing of the result, he is influenced that such a center is necessary in Israel. And in the morning we have also a close discussion with a French strategist, Dr. Brunet. He participated also in the 2 white paper under Hollande and Sarkozy. You know, the French, when they have a new government, they are writing a white paper which covers all the securities and other issues. So our very urgent mission now is to propose model and methodology for Israel, how to establish Israel maritime strategy. So we try to advise him, and it was a close and very limited briefing, but very interesting. Admiral Raphad, a good friend of Israel, not only now, we have with us our ex-naval attaché to the US, Admiral Lux, we call him Longo, and I think that he stayed there during the time that he was the CNO, and respect very much the treatment that the Israeli Navy got from Gaaari. He served as the US Navy 29th Chief of Naval Operation after holding 6 operational command, and is one of the only 2 officers in the history of the Navy to have commanded both US Atlantic and Pacific Fleet. As a Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ráfhead led the Navy through a challenging period of transition in fiscal, security, and personnel matters. He accelerated the Navy's capability and capacity in ballistic missile defense and unmanned air and underwater systems. He re-established the 4th and the 10th fleets to better focus on the Western Hemisphere and the cyber operations recently, and introduced bold programs prepared to the primacy of the information in warfare. In retirement, Admiral Ráfhead is a Robert and Marion Oster Distinguished Military Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and serves on the board of directors of Northrop Grumman Corporation, Maersk Line, Lloyd, and the Center for New American Security. He is a trustee of Dodge and Cox funds and serves on the board of managers of the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. He advises companies in the national security and medical sector. So, thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you.
And the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Shaul. Thank you. Well, Shaul, thank you very much. It's a true pleasure to be here at the museum. And I would say an unexpected honor for me to be able to meet Admiral Erel. I know that you have inspired many Israelis in your Navy and in your country, but I will also tell you as a young man during the Six-Day War, it shaped my thinking and gave me direction as to where I eventually ended up in life as I followed the events in the United States, even at that young age. So a true honor, sir, to meet you. Thank you very much. I'm going to disappoint a bit tonight. One is that the schedule that I was given had me speaking for 2 hours. I'm not going to speak for 2 hours. The other is that I will not use any PowerPoint slides. I've served in our military, as Shaul mentioned, for almost 4 decades. The last 4 were in the Pentagon in the United States, and my therapist told me that I could not use PowerPoint for 8 years after I retired. So I have 3 more years to go. And I have to admit, I may go to my therapist and see if I can get an extension on that as well. But if during my talk I am a bit distracted, it's really because of Shaul. He arranged for me to have some media interviews this morning. And the problem I have is not the media that I met with. They were very professional, very good. I enjoyed the interaction. But one of the interviews was at the seaside at a cafe in Jaffa, where we talked with a bright young reporter. And so now I have the problem of going home. And believe me, with my complexion, I will be sunburned by the time I get off the airplane in Washington, after telling my wife that it was 2 full days of meeting at a university. So, Shaul, if you could arrange for combat pay when I get home, I would appreciate that. But I would like today really to be able to have a discussion about the Commission and the maritime strategy challenges and opportunities that I think are ahead for both of our countries. And I would also like to applaud Shaul for his vision and the initiative that he had in partnering with the Hudson Institute in the United States in Washington in establishing the Commission on the Eastern Mediterranean, and also for bringing the research center into being. And I would like to congratulate Shaul and his team and those who have participated in the center for what you have accomplished in just one short year. As we discussed yesterday, and I think with many of us being former naval officers and military officers, we tend to look back and beat ourselves up about all of the things that we could have done. And too often we don't look at what we have done. And I would say that in the short year that the center has been around, the direction, the opportunities that we discussed these last couple of days, I congratulate you on your team on that. So I also thank you for letting me be a part of the discussions and hopefully participate in a constructive way in keeping, as we sailors say, the center headed fair down the channel. In being part of the commission, it was a true personal and professional pleasure for me to be part of the group. As some of you may know, there were 10 of us, American and Israeli. We had different backgrounds and experiences. There were some who had moved and operated in the political sphere for much of their lives, and even then they were of different political backgrounds. But I will tell you that Shaul and the U.S. co-chair, former U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, had just the right touch in kind of steering this group of people along. People that I know you know had no egos at all as we had our discussions, but they did it masterfully. We met twice, once in Haifa in February of 2016, and then we met again in April of that same year in Washington. And in the world that we live in today, there is a continued and lively discussion, as you know, that goes on before, between, and after the meetings, especially when you're trying to condense your findings into a report. But I will tell you that having served on many groups like this and task forces, as we all have during our lives, I can tell you that I've never worked with a more thoughtful, a more accomplished group than those who were on the commission. To a person, they brought perspectives and insight, and importantly, an openness to our deliberations that were enlightening and they were constructive. The environment and the topics that we discussed caused each of us to think deeply about the topics, about the issues, but I would say because of Shaul and Mary's leadership, to allow us to challenge what we believed, the assumptions that we had. And in doing so, we were able to engage on the challenges and the opportunities. But I think in dealing with this subject, whether it's in the United States or in Israel, the obligations that we have going forward, the obligations that we have as people who have been in the maritime domain, who are committed to the future prosperity and security of our countries, the obligations we have to look to the future. I think you know that my interest in dealing with something like the Eastern Mediterranean is always going to be high. It's also stimulating, I think, to be able to participate in events like that and pull yourself away from the headlines of the day, from the information saturation that we're all exposed to, and to be able to give serious thought and discussion to the strategic issues that are facing our countries, that are facing the region, and because of the criticality of this region, I would say our world. The U.S. is the preeminent naval power in the world, and it was my privilege and pleasure to be part of the U.S. Navy as we moved into different environments. But it was also refreshing for me in this process to be able to fold in maritime thinking into the discussions. The U.S. has been in the Middle East for a long time, and as some of my colleagues at the center know from discussions we've had, I have been in the Middle East for a long time. I left the United States when I was 2 years old, and for 50 years my family lived in the Middle East. I left the Middle East when I went away to school and then went in the Navy and moved around. So it's a topic that's very close to me. But I would say that in recent years, particularly in the last decade and a half, the last 15 years, the U.S. Has been very focused on the Middle East, but we've been very focused on the land of the Middle East and the protracted wars that we have been fighting there. As Israel lives in a condition of constant conflict, but for the United States, the 15 years that we have spent in Iraq and Afghanistan is the longest period of sustained combat in the history of our nation. But we've been very land focused there, and the maritime aspect, I believe, has been quite neglected. So in my mind, as we were working through this process, the Commission and the work of the Maritime Center can contribute to the strategic thinking and also bring attention to the Eastern Mediterranean, and also to the broader Mediterranean and to the Red Sea and its approaches. And I think this continued discussion, discourse, debate is important in Israel because, as I observe, and it has been reinforced by my Israeli colleagues, that maritime discussion does not take place in Israel. I think it's important in the United States, the work of the Commission, because we in the United States need to re-energize, reinvigorate our maritime discussion because we have been so focused on the land. The Mediterranean has long been a sea of commerce and conflict, and it remains so today. It's also a sea on which history has been written, and that story will continue to be written by you, by us, and by the future generations of our citizens that follow in our wake. And so I think that we are on the cusp of being able to energize discussions that will allow us to provide solutions to our future leaders. I don't have to lecture on the disorder of the region that has been in place for quite a while. For the United States, especially since 9/11, which was a transformational day for us, nor the fact that we are still adjusting to the end of the Cold War. From my perspective as a service chief, you can see in our culture and our views that we still have the hangover of what it was to serve during that time. And I think it's important that as we look to that future, the maritime considerations have to be front and center. I think as the Commission looked at our task, it is also of extraordinary consequence that Israel has a newfound economic interest that lies in its maritime space. The large energy reserves that are in your exclusive economic zone. The offshore energy deposits are an opportunity and a potential windfall of such transformative nature that it will affect the economy and the security of Israel, the region, and I would submit beyond. The relatively recent find presents and indeed demands a new look at a national strategy that now has a broad and more significant maritime aspect, and one which will drive the public, the economic, the technical, and the environmental policy considerations for generations to come. In the case of the United States, the Commission's work occurred following our rebalance or the pivot to Asia, and we can discuss that later. It also comes after a significant withdrawal of the tens of thousands of forces that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it also follows the adoption of the comprehensive plan of action to prevent Iran's nuclear program from advancing. And I think all of these prompt questions of American commitment to and American alignment in the region. Since the Commission's deliberation and report, the leadership in the United States has changed. And with it, there will be potential changes in the security and the economic agenda of our country. It's still very early in an administration, and having been in Washington during 3 transition periods, regardless of all the noise, it's still very early in the transition period. And so the policies, whether it's security, economic, or public policy, trade policy, still has yet to be precisely articulated. But I think it really is noteworthy, as has been pointed out in the press, that President Trump's first visit was to the region, and particularly to Israel. There is no question that with that move, which has been so different than any other president that has come along, with that move, it's a clear indication of where there will be a priority under his leadership. Regardless of the precise course that the administration sets, what must be addressed in this discussion of the maritime Middle East and strategy, in my mind, are Iran, the protracted Sunni-Shia conflict, the relationship of Iran and Russia that will affect and in some cases threaten the interests of the Sunni Arab states, of Israel, and of the United States. And we must also bear in mind that there are other nations and with other ambitions that will be operating and will have interest in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the work of the Commission and the Center is important, because in all of these there's a very, very important maritime dimension to them. Iran, in my view, now will have less restricted access to capital and technology, and will be able to recapitalize its Navy, adding capacity. And when I talk about capacity, it's the numbers of things and capability, the effectiveness of those things, that will enable increased presence and influence in the North Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and eventually in the Mediterranean. These are all consequential for the U.S. And for Israel, and I would submit for the Sunni states. In visits to Saudi Arabia, when I talk to my friends there, and I talk about wanting to discuss the country to the east, they most often say, "You don't understand. They're to the east, they're to the south, and they're to the west." And so there's a sense of encirclement, and this is even before I believe Iran will begin to move. I think that we have to be mindful that Iran, even though it's apportioned its naval forces, meaning the Revolutionary Guard and its conventional Navy, it's apportioned the Guard to the Gulf, and now I think you will see a more expansive conventional Navy moving out and about, and the Guard also benefiting from some of that recapitalization will even become more challenging for those navies that are operating in the Persian Gulf. I think that we'll also invest in weapons whose reach will be more extensive, so that it will, from its individual ships or submarines, be able to hold larger areas at risk than what we see today. And that same capability will increase Iran's influence, its maritime influence, and that will in turn enhance proliferation of conventional and non-conventional weapons, and it will facilitate a maritime environment more conducive to terrorism than exists today. Iran's development in the maritime space will be a factor in its strategic thinking, its regional hegemonic ambition, and both of those in turn will influence decisions on the future of its nuclear program. Russia is likely to stretch and press its Navy to maintain a naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean to support its client Syria. Russia and Iran, although not always trusting of one another, will have cause to cooperate, not just in Syria, but they may see their interests aligning in ways that further threaten the interests of our countries and like-minded states in the region. Turkey is going to be a force in the Eastern Mediterranean, But the Turkey of today is different than the Turkey of just a few years ago. It remains a NATO country, but it has a heightened Muslim identity. It's still dealing with the aftermath of the coup and a referendum, and how it will move forward, I think, is still a question. Improved relations with Israel, quarrels with the European Union, troubled aspects of its relationship with the U.S., a desire to wean itself from Russian energy are complexities that have to play in to our thinking on a maritime strategy. And we have a distant rising power that's now on the scene, China. It's strategically very patient and driven by a coherent economic and security strategy in the form of one belt, one road. China will make economic inroads that will be followed, I believe, by an increasing naval presence and capability and activity along this maritime Silk Road that extends from the East Asian littoral, South China Sea, Indian Ocean, to the Red Sea, with branches down into East Africa, and then also up into the Mediterranean. And I think that we're beginning to see that now. It's Newport in Djibouti, a very strategic area. There are a lot of people in Djibouti, including us. But in China's case, for years, my Chinese friends have been saying, we will never have an overseas base. They now have that overseas base. And as I said, much of their efforts will be in the economic space. And Israel is well aware of that, in Ashdod and Haifa, as far as the economic inroads that they have. And I think I'm being frank, being blunt. You are starting with a lot of suspicion anyway. As I said,
it is within our tradition, history, culture, so...
But I'm talking about outsiders too. You know, when they look at, should I go do gas off Mozambique or Israel? You know, so I think that a proactive strategy, discussion, to your point, predictability in policy, you have to probably start faster than everybody else because of the perceptions that people have. Yes, sir.
Admiral, you know that I'm interested in the South China Sea.
Right.
We discussed it already, but you mentioned a few things about the Eastern Mediterranean and the arriving of the Chinese Navy, which all of us suspected will do it.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese Navy, or China, never had a blue Navy unless in the 16th century with this Admiral He traveling around.
Mm-hmm.
And now they changed completely the policy. My question is, how will the U.S. Navy react to Chinese fleet or Chinese ships in the Eastern Mediterranean? And do you think it's a real threat, or they just want to project power in order to defend or to secure the shipping lines to make sure the one belt, one road is working correctly from the economical point of view?
Yeah.
Because I don't believe, my humble saying is, that they are looking to take, to put influence otherwise than economic.
Yeah.
Now, one more sentence. I just want to tell you why there was hesitation to ask questions. This is the nature of the Israeli Navy. Usually at the back are sitting second lieutenants.
Right.
So they are the first to ask. But now there are no second lieutenants, so the senior officers hesitated.
I know. Kind of the intentions of China's Blue Water Navy. My view on the rise of China's Navy, as I mentioned in my remarks, they're following a pattern. That it would be delusional on our part to not think, as their economic interests grew, that they would just sit back and say, well, the U.S. Navy, you're kind of the global guys, why don't you go do it? I mean, that's just not the way it will work. I think the question is, as long, and we've been very open with the Chinese, we have worked to fold them into some of the activities, that as long as they're complying with this idea of the commons free access. We talked last night about our freedom of navigation operations. We don't do that to upset the Chinese. We do that to demonstrate, as we do freedom of navigation operations with many countries, against many countries. We do that to demonstrate that this, we have a view of this international common space, and we will exercise our right to do that. So I think the question is, as long as China is, operating in the international norms that we have all come to expect, they're going to be out there. They're going to be out and about. But in some cases, they do. They are, without question, a navy in transition. There is no question that they will grow in their capabilities. And as I said, they're strategically very patient. My first exposure to the leadership of the PLA Navy was in the mid-90s. And we had intelligence that they had a carrier program underway, a carrier office or whatever it was. So we happened to be with an admiral by the name of Liu Huaqing, who is kind of legendary in their Navy. And we were meeting with him, a small group of us, and we said, "We hear you're interested in a carrier." He said, "Yes, we are." We said, "When would you like to have one?" This is 1994. And he said, "In the short term, we would like to have a carrier." And then we asked, "Well, what's the short term?" And I'll never forget it. He kind of went, 2050 would be good. So, they're on a different timeline. And I think that, we have to be mindful of that. I also would submit that the area where I think the biggest friction is going to come is in the Chinese distant offshore fishing fleets. There are 14 million people employed in the fishing industry in China. They are fishing far and wide. They're going through EEZs in Africa, South America, and I think that that's going to be problematic because they're going through other countries' EEZs and just like a vacuum cleaner pulling the fish out. And so I think that's going to be one of the first points of friction, not between the U.S. and China on fishing. And penetrating EEZs, right. And so I do think that their capacity, and in the U.S. we take 9% of our protein from fish. In Southeast Asia, in Asia, it's about 25-26% from fish. So they're going to be pulling that. So I think that's going to be an issue.
You have to teach them to grow catfish.
They're doing it already. They have a huge aquaculture thing.
One question.
Yes, sir. And then I'm going to get back to the young crowd because they have more hands up than you do.
We've seen on the media, I'm referring to the Arab Sea, Iranian Navy. It is coming more and more, sometimes very powerful, against the American naval units.
Mm-hmm.
And the reaction of the American naval units, again, what you see in the media, is very minor.
Yeah.
How do you explain it?
Yeah, I think, and what you're talking about, what I would refer to as the Persian Gulf. Yeah. The behavior of the Revolutionary Guard has been problematic for many years against the U.S. Navy. And when I was commanding a ship in the Gulf, and then later on an aircraft carrier group, it was part of the routine. And I think that we'll continue to see that type of behavior. I, for one, was not very pleased when they seized our sailors in that effort. But I think, and I'm being very open here, in our negotiations we should have linked more into what we were pursuing in the case of the comprehensive plan. I would have said, more behavior like that? No. So I think we need to press them on it. I would also say that, you know, the tactical problem is significant. When you get 40 high-speed boats coming at you, and you don't know where they're going, and you have to make the decision, you know, do we shoot or do we not shoot? With this group, I think you would understand. A lot of people said, well, when they get to 2 miles, you kill them all. You know, do you always do that? You know, but then
coming
more and more. Right, but I also would submit that this is where, and again, I'm not a person that says technology is always the answer, but if you've noticed, we are really working very hard on directed energy. And I think that that's the type of weapon that we're going to need to counter these. But I think that's just part of the drill. Back here. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, I sort of get the impression, and I wonder if it's correct, that there's more naval cooperation, cooperation between navies, or security forces at sea, let's call it, than there is between land-based armies, parts of the army, or even the Air Force. Do you think that's right? How do you see it?
Yeah. There seems to be more cooperation among navies, maritime forces than there are among land and air forces, and I completely agree with that. And I think it's because of our culture. You know, when we all go to sea, I don't care what country you're in, you have another problem to deal with, and that's the ocean. And so there's this common view that we have. There's also, I think, and I'm not, you know, a Pollyanna, but there is a tendency on the part of human beings that when somebody is in trouble, they will help. And I recall in the Cold War, I was a young officer standing a bridge watch, and we were taking our ship into the Black Sea. And we were going through the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, and this is when things were really pretty tight. So we came out into the Black Sea, and as is always the case, there were 2 Soviet ships who were there. But during the course of our transit, one of our sailors, and we were in a 2-ship group, had been grinding some metal and took a metal sliver in his eye. So he was all patched up, bandaged. We had the doctor on our ship, so we stopped, put the sailor in a boat to bring him over to the doctor. And here are these 2 Russian warships bristling with weapons. They were going to give us a hard time the entire time we were in the Black Sea. And a flashing light message came over from one of the Soviet ships, and he said, I have a doctor. Do you need him? You know, that was at the height of the Cold War. I just think it's part of the culture. And I think then that's why, as you look at the maritime strategy, how do you deal with other countries, even countries you don't get along with very well? How do you bring them in? Because I think, to your point, there is a natural affinity, a common experience, a common bond that should, in my view, should be part of going forward. In fact, if you look at the title of the maritime strategy that we most recently issued, it's a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power. And it's hard, and sometimes it goes off the rails, and sometimes you have to bring it back on. But, yes, sir.
The new gas deposits.
But China, is doing what other maritime powers throughout history have done, whether it's the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the U.S. As their economy, as their trade, as their maritime interests grow, they grow their navy, and they put that navy along the sea lanes that are important to them. And so that's what I see playing out in the future. And China will be a factor in the Mediterranean. However, as one who's spent the past 2 decades focused on the Asia Pacific, China's interpretation of maritime issues and maritime protocols and maritime law as not always consistent with the international norms that other countries observe. The conflicts in the Middle East and the Sahel and their associated humanitarian tragedy will continue to feed the hazardous maritime migrant flows in the eastern and central Mediterranean. And the ongoing humanitarian tragedy will demand a response that will continue to stress affected regional navies and challenge their ability to prioritize other missions. So I think we'll see the European navies are going to be more focused on this aspect of maritime activity, and the Eastern Mediterranean may not get the attention from them that it deserves. But I think we also have to keep in mind that the Mediterranean is a sea of commerce. It's been that way throughout history, and I believe in the American maritime strategy, of which I was able to have a part in producing during my time, really highlighted the effect of the fact that the seas connect us more than the seas separate us. And over history, I think that has been the case. And Israel, I believe, now finds itself in that position because of what you have offshore in your EEZ. And in my mind, this is huge. The billions of cubic meters of gas is a game changer, whether it's in Tamar or Leviathan. I will not get into the politics of that. I leave that to my Israeli colleagues to talk about it. But you know, in my view, truly game changers. Whether you're considering the domestic use that is now available or potentially available, and markets in Jordan, Turkey, Europe, energy linkages to other producers such as Egypt and Cyprus, and perhaps in time Lebanon and Gaza, can change the economic security and calculus of the region. Offshore energy deposits, as you so well know, are not without their security and environmental challenges. The factors are many in developing an effective and a coherent and acceptable solutions and strategies, and that's really hard work, and I don't minimize it at all. But my experience over the years and recently with the Commission give me confidence that these challenges can be addressed very well, very effectively, through serious thought, constructive dialogue, pursuit of facts, and uncompromised analysis. And I would submit that that's one area where, at least in the US, we've kind of fallen off hard analysis, facts, and not compromising it, and being able to use that in the decision-making process. I think all of these are things in which the center can make a huge contribution to this discussion that needs to take place. I would also say that the finds in Tamar and Leviathan really should not be viewed as a snapshot, but rather should be seen as the beginning of a motion picture that has just begun. And the work of the Commission and the centers and the other stakeholders must be undertaken with an eye that there will be potential other reserves yet to be found, whether that's gas or oil, and that has to be part of the discussion. The laws and the regulations that are put in place should encourage continued improvement of government processes and aim to improve the business environment while safeguarding the valuable natural environment and of the country and the marine and coastal ecosystems. All this, of course, must be considered in the context that Israel is not the only country that now has major gas reserves. The others will be moving out. And so I think a sense of urgency in moving forward in this area in energy policy and maritime policy, and the perceptions of stability and predictability that can be given as you move forward are going to be a huge competitive advantage. You know, I often used to tell my folks when a lot of things were going on around them, I would say, thank God for challenges. They give us something to do. And I think that's the case here, and that's why the Commission was formed. I think that's what the center is about. and there are a lot of things to do. And you've probably read the report, but I'll just highlight some things that I think are key and critical and whose time has come. You know, I talked about Israel's maritime interests and the potential having changed. What should the maritime strategy be, and how does it comport with an energy strategy? And how do both fit into a broad national strategy? How can the concept of the sea as strategic depth be developed? What methods and processes should be used to formulate this comprehensive maritime strategy? Who are the stakeholders? How are the interests of the stakeholders integrated into a coherent strategy? And how is the strategy best articulated, not just among those who are in the process and who have specific interests, but among the public? I mentioned that I participated and issued a maritime strategy for the U.S. Navy, but it was the first one also that was signed by myself as the CNO, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The three of us signed it. I know some of the European countries have their ministers across the board sign it, but one of the things that we did was to spend a year, which seems like a long time when you're trying to get a product out, having what we called conversations with the country, where we traveled around, we brought groups together, some of whom had never thought of this before, some who had business interests, maybe some personal historic interest, and we listened. We also talked about things. And I would submit that some of the questions we got were ones we hadn't thought of. I happened to be in Denver, Colorado, high in the Rocky Mountains. And the first question I got was someone who stood up and said, Admiral, I'm wondering why you're here. The only thing I can figure out is that you must be taking this climate change really seriously, and you're going to make Denver a port here pretty soon. So you get the whole range of things. But we found, quite frankly, that where we had the best engagement was not on the coast. It was in places like Kansas City, Denver. Why? Because those were major transportation thoroughfares, rail and truck. They understood trade. They understood what fed the economy, and they knew that that came from the sea. And so this can be a long process, but there are ways to do it. For the U.S., I think now is the time where we have to consider our maritime presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the aftermath of the Cold War, we drew down because we didn't think that there needed to be a presence. I think that was not prudent, and it will be increasingly imprudent because the vacuum will be filled. It will be filled by someone. How can the U.S. increase the naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean? The new administration has indicated a desire to build the fleet to 355 ships, which is a very ambitious undertaking. As you all know who have been in the business, that takes time and that takes money. And so, how can you get more deployable ships while you're waiting for that force structure to increase? If forward deployment for the U.S. Navy has become an option, and the term forward deployment that we use is a term of art because we don't home port ships in other people's countries. We forward deploy them there. And we do that in Spain recently, in Singapore more recently, and we have a significant forward deployed presence in Japan. We know from those experiences that forward deployment enables more predictability and presence in the regions where we are, more routine and robust exercising bilaterally with the host country. It increases and ties the navies together in ways that you don't see anywhere else. And it also is a means to have more multilateral activity in a region. And it allows the U.S. to respond more quickly in those places where we are forward deployed. For example, the shooters that did the deed in Syria were the ships that were forward deployed in Spain. When we have had to respond in the Western Pacific, whether to events in North Korea or to natural disasters, it's the ships that are in Japan that are the first ones to arrive. Is Haifa an option for that? This is complex for both countries with a lot of aspects to work through, but I think it's a discussion that can be helpful. How do the U.S. and Israel cooperatively assess the maritime environment and the players that are in this maritime environment and develop complementary policies when our interests may be different, the state of our relations with the third party or fourth party or fifth party may be different. How do we align our policies? Increased activity by Russia, Iran, and other maritime actors, whether they're benevolent or malevolent, demand vastly improved air and maritime domain awareness. How can Israel and the U.S. cooperate technically and procedurally to be on the leading edge of what I think is going to become a much, much more complex maritime environment, whether it's above, on, or under the sea? We're on the cusp of an explosion in the use of unmanned technology. And when we talk about unmanned technology, we immediately think about all the UAVs that have been flying around and part of combat operations in recent years. But I really do believe that unmanned underwater technology, whether it's what I call swimmers, that are unmanned submarines of various sizes, or bottom crawlers that can work the bottom of the ocean in particular areas, or stationary nodes, whether it's just a sensing node, or perhaps an energy node where some of these vehicles can go in and take power from and then go off and do their other things. I really do think that unmanned underwater technology will change the nature of warfare even more than unmanned air technology. And here is where our innovative cultures, that I think are really unique to the U.S. and Israel, can come together and advance those technologies that are perfect for monitoring and assuring the security of undersea energy extraction and distribution infrastructure. And at the same time, that technology is also applicable to research, to environmental monitoring. So I think there could be many levels of unmanned underwater technology that can be brought to bear. And then as we move into this new space, and as we connect all of these systems, the issue of cyber security and cyber resiliency will come into play. How do we work cooperatively down that path to make sure that we're complementary? Getting into the energy area, what are the implications of the gas resources? What opportunities do the resources offer for energy cooperation with neighbors? What frictions may arise? And what are the implications even here as your economy evolves because of that? It's likely, even though when I look at the claims that exist in the Mediterranean, and they look pretty wonderful to me compared to the South China Sea and the East China Sea. In time, and as resources become more apparent and the wealth of those resources become more apparent, will there be maritime disputes? And so how do you begin to think about these even before they become a dispute, even before they're identified as a dispute? And I will tell you, as someone that has worked in the messier areas of maritime claims, you do get into a lively debate with some countries who are in UNCLOS when you are not in UNCLOS. And so how do we work our way through there? And then again, I've mentioned a couple times, how do energy and the environmental interests align as part of this maritime strategy? How do the positions that either the U.S. or Israel or U.S. and Israel take comport with international organizations and international initiatives? And I think that international piece is big. And then something that I think is so important, we've talked about it in our meetings, how do you begin to attract the bright young minds and the future leaders, the future thought leaders in policy, national security policy, energy policy, environmental policy? How do you attract them to engage, be an active participant, and become expert and active in the maritime space? Not just to lead in Israel, but to lead regionally and to lead internationally. Those are just a few areas that I've touched on. As I said, there are many in the report, and I think that if we had had another couple of days in either Haifa or US, we probably would have had a lot more. But the idea, I think, is really to use the report as a catalyst, and with the creation of the center, use the center as a vehicle to begin to move this thinking forward. Because there is no question in my mind that the maritime activity in the Middle East, and particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, is going to start moving very, very quickly. And speaking to a group of fellow sailors, we all know that time and tide don't wait. And so now is the time to move forward. And I will stop there, and I look forward to a discussion with you. Thank you for your attention. I know people have something to say. I've been told that I'm in Israel, so I will get opinions at least. I was only kidding. I have another hour and a half of script that I can go back to if you don't want to do that. I think that, is there somebody back there that had a question? No? Yeah.
Well, I'm curious.
Good. Okay, we got one here.
I'll take it. My name is Oren Scheffler. I'm interested in the offshore infrastructure aspect and how an offshore infrastructure facility producing oil and gas for a country, or perhaps several countries, can affect the development of an effective national or maybe international naval policy in economic waters, on the highways of the seas, with all that restriction, multiple parties surrounding it, and this is a critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. The question was, how can the infrastructure, energy infrastructure on the bottom of the sea or float affect the national and maritime interests of the country, and how does it contribute to that? I would say it contributes and affects it in a huge way, and one that's quite dynamic. As you may know, in our Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Louisiana, primarily Texas, the underwater infrastructure is massive there. It is huge. It's also in an area that is prone to severe weather events. The other thing that I would say that comes into play, particularly in that area, which on the coast also has a lot of petrochemical and petroleum facilities, the impact of those facilities on the ecosystem, and And importantly, I don't get into the theological debates on climate change, but the fact of the matter is the climate is changing, the planet is changing, the sea levels are rising and will rise. Pardon?
Does Trump know it?
I think he does, but I'll leave him to talk to it. But the other thing that's happening is that in many of the coastal areas, not just that petrochemical infrastructure, but when you go to the mega cities like Karachi and other places, they're settling. So you have settlement, you have sea level rise, and I would say that how you set policy for that area, because you have to balance the economic and the security and the environmental. I would also say that one of my concerns was for the extensive underwater piping systems that are there, and how do you protect them? How do you monitor them? How do you counter some of this new technology that's going to come in? I talked about unmanned underwater bottom crawlers. Let's say that, for example, that technology were to be put in place in the Gulf of Mexico for us, or when you build out extensive infrastructure. How do you know when a new crawler has come in? How do you sense that? Because it will be extraordinarily silent. It can come in, it can lie off, a kilometer from the critical infrastructure for months. And then when somebody tells it to come in, it can come in and do damage. So how do you deal with that? How do you sense the airspace? And I think that drives your policies, it drives your investments on how you do that. So I think that there's a huge factor. I will tell you, we had the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, and that was a national effort that we had to respond to. I mean, there was the environmental mess on the Gulf Coast. Won't even get into the legal issues and the claims and what have you. But being able to have the technology to go in and try to cap that. Deepwater Horizon was releasing at about, I think it was 5,000 feet or something like that. And that one thing that never really got talked about, that we became very concerned about, and this is where it was actually the Navy that raised the issue. There is a current in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a gyre that moves. And everything was fine. I mean, there's a lot of oil coming out. The mess was huge. We flew in every bit of oil containment and response equipment that we had in the Persian Gulf. We have a lot of it standing by there for obvious reasons. We flew all of that in. We flew every bit of what we had around the country to work that problem. But the oceanographer came to me and he said, the gyre is starting to behave badly. And we were watching on a daily basis this beautiful gyre that moved. It started to stretch and stretch down toward the Straits of Florida. And we kept watching it. It would retreat, it would go down. And we were absolutely obsessed with the fact that if that gyre broke down, it would go through the Straits of Florida, join the Gulf Stream, and then what do you have? Whole east coast of the United States. So long answer, I apologize, but it's the only question I have so far, so I'm milking it for everything I have. But I think that, that's how, I think we really need to think about the infrastructure. Obviously, our coastline is a little bit longer, but how do you understand what's happening, and how do you know what's taking place, and how do you respond to, the other guy gets a vote with new technology too. And so how does it all fit together, and how do you organize yourself to be able to respond in a coordinated way? There's a lot of ad hoc stuff that was going on in Deepwater Horizon. But
I don't know if
sure.
The idea is to listen to you and not to me, but
Yeah.
if I can add in the specific area in which we live, and we discussed it in Washington and even yesterday. The Admiral said before that the sea traditionally, along the history, was more a passage than a border. And we have to keep it in mind because if we emphasize too much the security aspect of the treasure that we have at sea, investors will not come. And if investors will not come, we shall not be able to see it flourishing or to get all what we can. So to keep the balance between risk and opportunities, I think that especially in the Middle East, especially in our case, is a balance that probably in the case of Mexico or the Gulf of Mexico is not as necessary as in the case of Israel.
Yeah, and if I could add on that, I mean, too.
They tried in 2012 to buy a big stake of Leviathan, but were blocked mainly by Noble Energy, who didn't want them involved. But Rosneft did buy a big stake of the new gas field in Egypt, and they're interested in Lebanon and in Cyprus. And whether you think Israel should be concerned about Russian involvement, because economic reasons are not maybe the main reasons why they're trying to be involved. They're trying to get naval access here.
Yeah.
Should Israel continue blocking Russian companies? Is that the new policy? Or?
Shaul, I think you need to add this list on the topics to be researched at the center. You know, no, really, I think that that's a question that I think from a national. I'm sorry.
Looking for a grant.
Every question
A bright young man.
come with the money in order to
That's right.
give you the answer.
No, I think that that's something that you're going to have to deal with, and it's not uncommon. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico, a couple of years ago, there was a Canadian company that bid on some gas in the Gulf of Mexico. The concessions were very, very close to where we do a lot of naval aviation training, and we also do some testing. That Canadian company was owned by a Chinese company. So we had to go through that process and determine, what was in the best interest of the country. There were positions on both sides of it all, and I think that's part of the process. And so, my question, as I mentioned in my remarks, is how do you set up your maritime strategy? And I'm glad you asked it, because a lot of times people think a maritime strategy is about navies. It's really not. So how do you set it up, and how do you work your way through it? And I think the maritime strategy won't give you the answer to that particular problem, but it'll give you the template to think about that problem and to make decisions about it. And it will have been thought about at a national level, so that when it does come up, it's not hitting you in the face for the first time. Yes, sir.
My name is Shachar Podoli. Having heard about problems expected in the Eastern Mediterranean with respect to the gas, so you're aware of that very narrow triangle between Israel and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Controversial. Tomorrow, so to speak, Noble Energy will decide to put a drill inside.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think will happen?
I don't know. We'll see.
Oh,
And, no, yeah. And, but
it's not just Lebanon. It's the Hezbollah who said
Exactly.
that they'll protect that triangle.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, these type of issues are going to become more pronounced. As I said, I've been in the Asia Pacific for a long time, and as John knows, the claims in the South and East China Sea have been around for a long time. As soon as there's wealth associated with them, they take on a completely different dimension. And if you know, the thing that is interesting to watch is Vietnam and China. When China keeps floating the oil rig into what Vietnam thinks it should be their area. So I think that, again, this is what the strategy should begin to try to, give some insight so that future decision makers have a foundation upon which to work. Yes, sir.
There is a feeling that there is a big gap between what the United States says and does concerning the development of mass destruction weapon in North Korea. What will happen if the Iranian will behave the same?
The question is some discrepancies between what the U.S. says and what it does with regard to North Korea's nuclear weapon program.
And the influence of it.
And what will the U.S. do if Iran starts behaving the same way? The short answer to your question is I don't know. But I think that in the case of North Korea, in the last year, we've moved into a new space. Two things. One, the missiles are getting better. Their nuclear testing, I think, has informed them. The other thing that is key is the fact that they've now gone to a solid propellant instead of a liquid propellant, which allows for a much faster setup, shoot, and back into the hide site again. And that was one of the reasons why we went in with THAAD. And so I also believe that the strike into Syria was not missed by Kim Jong-un. I'm not saying that's where the U.S. will go, because I don't know. But I think we're going to have to deal with North Korea in a more firm way, and may surprise some people that at some point, if you can get to a verifiable condition, and then also I would hinge on that some economic opening, then I think that the conditions may be right to sit down and start to have some conversations. But you have to be ready to walk away. So I think that's what may happen. And then Iran will, that I think is something that we're going to have to watch, especially as they gain more influence and create more effects in the region. I think that's going to change their thinking, and how we approach it, I think, is going to be really important.
Admiral, I think that at least I'll start with Iran. The regional aspect should be analyzed. In the case of North Korea, China will play a major role. And I'm sure that America, before acting, will try to create some regional coalition. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I understand the American strategy, it is something similar. And Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan is part of the question and the answer. So what will be the American or the world reaction when Iran will do whatever?
What I mean is that if the American will react earlier, it's better.
Well, I think the thing that is true about North Korea is that, and I agree with Hami, that China is working. China, I think, is quite frustrated with the young man. But also China, the last thing that China wants is a unified American ally on its border. So it has to figure out how to play that game.
Yes,
so.
Regarding China, I want to go back to China. China has a big problem to push Korea because of the only left communist countries in the world. And China Communist Party is suffering from public image. So they cannot just stop Korea in one way. They have to do it politely according to Confucius methodology.
Yeah.
I want to ask another question.
Okay.
Recently, or very soon, few very important ports will be operated by Chinese companies. Haifa, Piraeus already, Djibouti, they are there. Will the U.S. Navy visit those port openly without any problems?
Yeah, I don't know, but the fact is we visit Chinese ports. So, you know, and when we go into ports, we know, you know, what we have to do. So I don't think simply because it's operated by Chinese, I would say, you know, no. I mean, that we will go in. Because, as I said, we go in and out of Chinese ports. We routinely put our aircraft carriers into Hong Kong. So I don't see that as being an impediment. I'm going to go back. Was there a question back here? Yes, sir.
Yes, just a quick question. You mentioned unmanned vessels quite a bit, and just to broaden it, one of the big changes that we may see is removing of the elimination of crew on board merchant vessels, or increased automation. How do you think that would change the maritime domain more broadly? And then just do you think that a similar thing could happen for military vessels?
Yeah.
Do you think we'd have sailors on board?
Yeah. The question is taking men and women off of merchant vessels, operating them in an unmanned way. Is that a feasible thing to do? And then will that evolve into unmanned naval vessels? One, I would say that the unmanned nature, I think, will be a function of where they operate. I don't know of a shipper who would sail an unmanned vessel through the Somali Basin. I think that there may be a huge amount of automation, but I think you have to think about that. Do you have to have someone on board in the event of an emergency or an environmental problem? I really do think in smaller applications there'll be more use of unmanned surface craft. I'm not sure we'll see a guided missile destroyer being unmanned, at least in my lifetime. But I think that we'll see, you know, more of that. I think the other thing that would be very interesting to pursue is the cyber assurances of your unmanned LNG carrier, for example. You know, in a way, it may make it easier to pirate that ship than a manned vessel, because if I can get into its control system and if I can capture that ship through cyber, you know, I can do some really neat things. But I do think we're going to see more and more unmanned. My experience has been in the unmanned world. The policies, I think, can be worked out. I think technically we are behind in other words, the technology is beyond us. And as I always say, there are three things in dealing with changes such as unmanned systems. One is policy. What do you know, does the country, does the service want to do it? You make that decision. Then there's the technical, and as I said, I think we are trailing behind where technology is. And the hardest thing is culture. I'll give you an example that I dealt with in the U.S. Navy. We were doing unmanned aviation and unmanned underwater vehicles. And when we decided to make a major push, both communities, both tribes said, we're not sure we like this. And it was interesting to watch, because at one point, the submariners, and I think there are a lot of submariners here, they just did a 180. And I immediately, knowing submariners, my instincts went up, because I knew something was going on. But what happened was the aviators continued to see the unmanned airplane as a threat to them. And the submariners got together and said, aha, this unmanned vehicle is an extension of my submarine. And you could see that cultural shift, and the leadership of that community shifted. And I think you potentially will see the American submarine community moving faster on unmanned. You know, we had, during my watch and then subsequently in my corporate area, we have launched, landed, and refueled a tailless airplane off of one of our aircraft carriers. You know where that airplane is right now? It's in mothballs. It's put away. Because the Navy is trying to figure out what to do. But it's just amazing. When, we have 4 wires on the aircraft carrier. When they were doing the first landing tests, they were saying, which wire do you want, 2 or 3? Every single time went to the exact wire. It's more precise than a manned airplane. That's a big threat. So I'm hopeful we'll start to see some enlightenment in the aviation community. I'm being perfectly frank, so and my aviators know how I felt about it. Yes, sir.
I'm sure that you know about it. That's a Norwegian corporation. I think it's the mother company of Simrad. They're trying to build now not only unmanned but fully autonomical ship that will be out to sea by the year 2019.
Yeah.
It's a threat.
I think that they're.
It will not work.
I would not go so far as to say that. Yeah.
It is for domestic use.
My opinion, as a seaman, it will not work. It cannot work.
Okay.
This is the voice of the sea.
We'll take a note of this and
The sea will not
come back
accept
in 2019.
Voice of the
Yes, sir.
seafarers.
I'm not a naval officer, I'm a historical political geographer. And when I learned and I've been teaching political geography, we were using the good old theories of Mackinder, Mahan, and other, in which the global maritime arena was controlled by 2 or 3 or 4 big powers which controlled everything in the sea, either military or civil activities. Now it seems that since the end of the Cold War, there are 2 different trajectories of development in this global arena which may be conflicting or not, I don't know. One is the atomization of the system. We see that although there are still big powers, first and foremost the United States, small countries, regional powers can obtain more lethal weapons which may threaten the dominance of the big navies. And on the other hand, it seems that there is a conflict developing between 2 powers, which one is the States and the other one, it seems that China is rising as the second power, or a rival, or main rival power of the United States. So from an American point of view, how do you consider the future development? Are you going to deal with predominantly an atomized world of power, or is China, or maybe your main rival? How so are you going to go back to the days of the Cold War in other dimensions, or you have to meet a totally different geopolitical order in the next decades?
I'm probably going to sound like a... and again, I would like to thank Shaul and his team for the hospitality, but moreover to commend them for what they've done in the short year that the center has been in existence, and to look for opportunities to continue to the work and drive toward a maritime strategy. So thank you very much.